Thank you, everyone. Those who have joined, we'll just give another minute for our participants to join in, and then we'll start the webinar. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world you're joining from. My name is Isha Saraswat, and on behalf of TAFSSA, Transforming Agri-Food Systems in South Asia, I welcome you to the TAFSSA webinar session 13, which is on climate shocks, impacts, responses, and adaptive capacity of smallholder farmers, evidence from district assessment in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. To start with the webinar, I would first like to invite Timothy Krupnik, who has worked in agricultural research for development in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Caribbean. He's right now with CIMMYT, where he leads a multidisciplinary and multicultural research team that comprises the Sustainable Agri-Food Systems Programs, Innovation Sciences in Agro-Ecosystems, and Food Systems themes across Asia. Over to you, Tim, for welcome remarks and setting the context for the webinar.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the 13th Transforming Agri-Food Systems in South Asia webinar. Very pleased to see so many people joining and tuning in to listen to this really important research and information that's been generated. TAFSSA, or Transforming Agri-Food Systems in South Asia, is a CGIAR regional integrated initiative. It focuses on all aspects of agri-food systems, from production through to markets to consumption, and also looking at environmental and climate-oriented consequences and adaptation needs around agri-food systems in South Asia. The initiative works across India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and has a small footprint of activities that have taken place also in Pakistan, which we would love to see expand. The design of this initiative is unique. It is an end-to-end, as I mentioned, agri-food systems initiative that focuses work on farming systems. It focuses work on where farmers produce diverse foods and food moves to the farm gate and from farm gates through value chains to consumers' plates. And then it looks quite a lot at nutrition, diets, and consumption issues. And it also, very importantly, as I mentioned, looks at the environmental, the social, the climate-oriented consequences of food systems within the region. But one of the things that binds together the work of TAFSSA most importantly has been work that we've done in our first work package, which is around generation of data and evidence that can be used to analyze food systems within the region in order for policymakers, for decision makers, for development planners, for people in the public and private sectors to make better sets of decision using data and evidence around agri-food systems. And so today we have one of our core team members, Shreya Chakrabarti, who is going to be presenting work that's been done looking at analysis of data from India, Nepal, and from Bangladesh through what we call TAFSSA's Integrated Agri-Food Systems Assessment. And this is a unique approach to assessing agri-food systems that was built upon in TAFSSA, applying the high-level panel of experts integrated agri-food systems or integrated data assessment approach for agri-food systems, but tailored specifically to looking at the peculiarities and the cultural issues associated with agri-food systems in diverse locations in Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. The data set that comes from the surveys that were completed that include representative samples of households involved in agri-food systems from across the 4 countries and a select number of states and districts are publicly available. And I will ask Esha and others to put links to information around the integrated agri-food systems assessment and also to the data sets in the chat so you can access them. In this work, Shreya will be presenting an understanding of climate adaptation approaches and work that has been done looking at the data set and analyzing agri-food systems from a climate adaptation lens. It is unique and interesting in terms of the work that we have done so far in presenting the different multifaceted aspects of the work that's been done around the integrated agri-food systems data set, in that it's the first piece that looks very strongly at issues around environment and on climate. And as Shreya will tell you, we've taken, or with Shreya's leadership, I should say, the initiative has taken a strong and very innovative approach to utilizing a framework that has been widely applied in other contexts, but tailoring it specifically to the South Asian context with information that can be generated with the framework, and which you will hear about today. So with that, I will stop in order for us to move into the webinar. But once again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. There's 72 people on the call right now. That's great. We might have more joining relatively soon. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and also specifically recognize and thank Shreya for her leadership and the work that she has done in putting this together. Over to you, Shreya.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, I'm gonna just share my screen and then we'll start with the presentation. Isha, is my screen visible? And is the
Yes.
full screen visible?
Yes, it
Okay.
is.
All right, so thanks everyone for joining. So what we are going to present today and have hopefully have a good discussion on is the issue that we're looking at is how are smallholders adapting to climate shocks. That's the overall issue at hand, but what we will also discuss a little bit today in terms of is this particular integrated survey that we conducted under TAFSSA, the climate module, in that what it allows you to do and the various ways in which you can actually utilize it to understand adaptation and adaptive capacity while giving it a framework of thought around adaptation. So just a little bit of a quick background in TAFSSA is to understand the integrated nature of the way the Transforming Agri-Food Systems in South Asia initiative, how the CGI was designed. It's essentially takes a plate to farm approach, which covers the entire gamut of issues from production, markets, to consumption, with cross-cutting issues of equity, of climate, and of data. And you can see these are the various important South Asia specific questions that we've taken on within TAFSSA, and it actually covers the entire system from production to consumption. And just to give a little bit of where we're coming from, well, while discussing about climate, and this is that there are different work packages through which we work, and while different work packages tend to focus on components of the system, which is from production, markets, access to consumption and diets, climate change, and looking at the data, which essentially comes from this integrated survey, essentially is what binds all of this work into one, and try to look at how knowing about the system essentially really helps with understanding, especially when it comes to climate adaptation. So I just want to introduce a bit in terms of the analytical frameworks and the data that we collected, and in what ways we were able to look at the analysis. So to start with was what essentially was collected. We looked at it was a short module, but it started essentially with understanding what was the experiences. It was a recall process of data collection for climate shocks. Ideal is when you're only doing an entire survey around a climate shock, you would just do a pre-shock and a post-shock. But when we're looking at more of an integrated survey, something that can be done at any point of time, and not climate shock specific, then a recall method really helps. Within the last 2 years, and in South Asia, almost every year, farmers are facing some of the other shocks. So we did give them a whole range of options in terms of what kind of shocks they faced. So we had experiences, whether they experienced climate shocks or not, what kind of impacts were faced, what kind of coping responses in the short term and the long term did they take on to respond to these shocks, and the domains of resources. So something that the integrated survey really offers us is that because it covered the entire system, it offers us access to data from about different domains of resources or assets that a particular household accesses. or has the ability to invest in information services. And how was it measured in terms of how we collected the data? So like I said, we did a recall of experiences. We had provided impacts and responses for the top 3 shocks that farmers reported, and the impacts and responses were that the options that we provided, and they were more flexible, but some of the coded responses that were provided were essentially covered the entire system, which is from agronomic, resource and infrastructure, market access, income and livelihoods, and consumption, which means that they're both impacts in terms of, as well as their responses could come from any place within the system, because we wanted to see how people actually respond to climate shocks. And we had a separate module on climate information services as well, whether farmers are able to access weather information, whether they get technical advisory based on the weather information. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you will find that all of the options that we have, that we had provided in terms of what kind of responses that farmers generally take on. And you'll find that because we were doing something much more systemic, that we looked at responses also in a more systemic way, rather than looking at them sectorally. So one of the ways in which this data can be used, and I'll focus a bit on the methods here because it's one of the ways that also gives an idea on how, because this data is open access, you can all use it. And this was one of the ways in which we use this module, and how we use this data to categorize and find responses to specific questions that we had. So because today we are asking the question on specifically how smallholders are responding to climate shocks. And there's a whole theory on how land size alone doesn't affect everything, right? So there are multiple capitals and multiple resources that can come, that can determine how households respond to climate shocks. And therefore, what we wanted to know was we wanted to find a typology of these various, we had like almost 22, 25 options in terms of the way people and households respond. We wanted to find a way to codify them, which allows us to look at a more hierarchical setup of adjustments, right? So it's not just sectoral, not just different kinds of adjustments, but whether there was a way to tell whether some kind of adjustments were better than others. So this was one of the ways in which we identified these different, so one of the ways in which we codified some of our responses, that there are different ways in which adjustments are generally made by households. So the worst off is the one where you are forced or compelled to only accept losses, which means that you do not have sufficient capacity to invest into solutions that can either keep your life where it is or make it better in the face of climate change. So accept losses is sort of the lowest in that hierarchy, where you either have to bear the loss or at best you can share the loss across the community. The other was where you have the ability to choose or change, which means you diversify, but you're able to maintain the way of life or the status of life that you're currently in. Were you able to change it sufficiently? You have to make the effort to move out into different kinds of cropping or different kinds of employment, etc., which could be a way to diversify where you access your resources and the most effective resources from. But you don't completely lose access to this. And the best case scenario is that you are able to invest in solutions that enable you to completely reduce your losses, which means that you're able to come out of a climate shock without being affected much at all, which means that you have been able to invest in solutions that have enabled you to fill in the gap that was created by climate shocks. So there are different ways in which these are done. You could even, so bearing and sharing the loss is one of the ways in which you accept losses. You could also reduce the loss by either completely preventing the effect or modifying the event, which is more on in terms of the way you mitigate it. Or you could change the way you use your resources or where you locate yourself and your livelihoods. So amongst all of the solutions, potential solutions that we have given across, along with option for more flexibility in terms of adding more solutions and responses that farmers did take on, we were able to identify these 3 categories and categorize all of our solutions and responses into these 3, which allowed us to then ask questions on whether small farmers tend to move more strongly towards one form of response to climate shocks. compared to large farmers or not. So this kind of a hierarchical framework is something that was permitted by the wide variety of options that we had, and it enabled a hypothesis which was more aligned with this hierarchical structuring of households by land size. The next thing which the integrated survey data really allows us to do is, because of the integrated nature and because it has been able to collect data from across the agri-food system, is that it provided us a way of thinking through adaptive capacity. Now, if you look at a lot of the secondary data which currently exists, even unit level sampled government data which exists, it does not collect really good data in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of responses, and those that do not provide you a lot of data in terms of other kinds of capitals that households actually have access to. So you do not know what kind of households and what kind of resources they have to be able to respond to the shocks and why they respond a certain way. So something that the integrated survey actually did was offered us sufficient indicators and variables from across the system to understand, to ask questions around who are these people, who are these households who are responding to climate shocks in a certain way and why. So adaptive capacity, what we did use was a framework on adaptive capacity, which is essentially derived, which is usually done and now quite popular in terms of assessing climate adaptive capacity, comes from the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework of the DFID, now FCDO, which essentially talks about 5 capitals. So we have 5 different kinds of capitals that make up the entire capital, the capital bundles and bundles of resources that households have access to, which enable them to shift from, one form of adaptation to another. So adaptive capacity is essentially the ability of systems, institutions, households, humans to adjust to the potential damage. So whether they have enough ability to invest in the gap filling, the gap which has been built by or created by the climate shock, whether they are able to invest in filling those. So there are 5 different resources that we looked at: natural capital, physical, financial, social, and human capital. Now, in terms of how it is measured, the integrated survey allowed us such a variety of responses and indicators that we had a lot of options that we could really create to identify all of these variables. So we looked at literature, and from all of the literature on adaptation that has been, we reviewed all the literature on South Asia and identified what are the different kinds of variables that different studies have taken in terms of identifying each of these capitals and how they defined it, and what are the various variables that they've used to characterize each of these capitals. And what we found, so we had done a review, and then we identified that these are the repeating variables that were found in literature. And then alongside that, what we did was we then, in association with each of these indicators and each of these indicator domains, we found the respective indicator that was available in the integrated survey, and we found that all of the indicators had a really good aligned indicator that was developed for assessing adaptive capacity. Now, why for the analysis that I will show today is this important? So one of the ways in which a lot of analysis has been done is that it creates an adaptive capacity index by doing an index across all of these indicators. But today we had a question on very, very specifically that I will present, is that on smallholders, how are smallholders adapting to climate shocks? Now, you will notice that land size is only one of the resources and only one of the categories across different kinds of indicators and capitals that generally affect adaptive capacity. Now, there's a lot of argument around how, it's all of these indicators together, and that land size or just access to resource alone does not affect everything. So we wanted to look at whether land size is playing a significant enough role across these indicators. So looking at all of the capitals was important to ask this question, because without being able to control for them, we were unable to say whether land size was important in determining whether different kinds of households actually adapted in different ways. So looking at some of the descriptors to tell you how we went about this data analysis and data collection and what all we collected and what kind of results it showed. So we looked at different kinds of climate shocks. For the entire data essentially covered 2 districts of Nepal, 2 districts of Bangladesh, and 1 district of India. That was the study area that we had selected for the initiative. And what we did was we looked at different kinds of shocks, and we also looked at how severely they faced these shocks. So you'll notice that different kinds of shocks have been faced unevenly across Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. It's not always the same. What we also did was that we realized that different kinds of shocks tend to lead to different types of impacts. Like some shocks were associated with certain impacts much more strongly compared to others, whereas other shocks were associated with other kinds of impacts. But what we are doing today is more of a cumulative assessment and not by each shock, but that is something that the data also allows you to do. So if anybody is using that data, that can be something that you can do. So what I would like to discuss today is, first thing is that how different, so impacts from that we saw from the climate shocks. We want to ask is that so much of adaptation conversation that we have today is very, very sectoral. For instance, so we have, adaptation for agriculture, and adaptation for livestock, adaptation for urban areas. So when we think of policy making, a lot of our policy making is very sectoral even now, right? But if you ask the same question in terms of when you go down to the household does not adapt sectorally. Household adapts based on every single adaptation solution available to it in a bundle, and chooses and picks out of that based on what is available to it, what it prioritizes, etc. So what we found was that that cropping related impacts were some of the highest in these last 2 years based on the climate shocks that households face. Cropping related impacts were some of the strongest, and everyone, like the majority, reported on these. There were much fewer in terms of infrastructure damage, livelihood, etc. But what we found when we tried to look at responses, we find that agronomic responses are not necessarily the maximum, right? So even though they are the most reported impacts, when people try to solve impacts from cropping, they do not just respond to agronomic responses and solutions. They are then looking for they respond with through water management, through managing risks in terms of taking insurance, taking loans, selling or having to mortgage assets, and somehow buffering their incomes. And there's a lot of consumption related where they've responses where they've had to either reduce food consumption, increase dependence on food rations. So the important sort of takeaway from that was that responses are not necessarily absolutely sectoral just because the problem is from a sector, but when you come to the household level, they respond with access to different kinds of sectors. So even when we think of adaptation policies and how we think of promoting adaptation for households, we have to think across the system and not just in terms of particular responses and particular sectors. So moving on to just very shortly on the initial results that we had, that when we asked the question on whether small farmers are adapting differently than large farmers, we looked at these 3 categories of accepting loss, diversifying loss, and reducing loss. And we find that across all the 3 countries, except for some of the differences for the medium farmers, the smallest farmers were always the highest. The landless and the small farmers always tended to move more towards solutions and responses that you could identify as accepting loss, which means that they have to bear the loss of the climate shock and therefore lose more in terms of what they had. Whereas the larger farmers were able to have higher responses in directions of either diversifying or reducing loss. So what happens clearly is that you are able to, so the large farmers are not affected at all, whereas the small farmers, so the lose whatever little they have, right? So which means that the inequalities between the haves and have-nots are therefore then being intensified because of the climate shock. So we found this across all of them. Right, so this is what I just covered. So we also did a quick probit to see that whether this categorization, whether this pattern holds when you actually control for the other indicators, because like I mentioned earlier, that theory tells us that these 5 kind of indicators all go into building adaptive capacity. So it was important that if you wanted to know whether small farmers, even if you controlled for all of the other indicators, was this pattern still noticeable? And we did find that the overall direction, which means that the small farmers tended to accept loss more and move in terms of diversifying and reducing loss lesser than the large farmers held even after controlling for all of the other capitals. So some of the insights that we wanted to take, so 2 or 3 things. So the idea was to look at small farmers and how they adapt today. And the second was what this data allows you to do. So if anybody here is wanting to use this data, it really offers you a lot of intersections and interaction with different aspects of the agri-food system. But in terms of takeaways from this very simple analysis, is that number one is, like I said, a systems perspective is essential. So much of adaptation today is being thought of sectorally that you end up losing a large chunk of understanding of how adaptation is done if you're only looking at particular sectors. And therefore, without looking at all of the sectors integrated way, you cannot provide and support adaptation in all of the ways that individuals and households on ground are actually adapting, right? So it cannot just be from the top. You have to understand how people are adapting on the ground to be able to support or disincentivize some of the adaptation responses and some of the ways in which households are adapting currently. It's also important to recognize the complexities of prioritization, which means that households, number one, don't adapt in only a particular direction, which means that they generally use a bundle of solutions to adapt. So each household could take 3 or 4 or 5 completely different adaptation solutions from the options that they have, from the bundles that they have. And not everyone has access to the same kinds of adaptation solutions. So it's important to understand these complexities, that thinking very narrowly about adaptation, number one, does not help. You have to take a systemic way. You have to understand that people do not, and households do not just respond in a particular way. They generally respond with a bundle of, could be across practices, technologies, institutional solutions, economic tools, or other kinds of social inclusion support. The other thing that we find is that technological support, which we tend to invest a lot of our research in and a lot of our focus in, are not necessarily the key responses of households. That despite the focus of adaptation research more in that direction in terms of innovation. But what we find is that existing social safety net development and poverty alleviation policies, which governments are anyway going forward with in terms of nutrition, food access, in terms of health, these are all social safety net policies are very important. And a lot of the households actually moved in the direction of using these social safety nets to adapt, right? So leaving development and, so the integration between development policies and adaptation policies is really important, that integration, even though it has been much in contention in terms of whether you invest in policies that are considered development policies or whether they should be adaptation policies separately. But the truth is that a lot of well-implemented development policy and social safety nets really support adaptation on a day-to-day basis for households. And therefore, it's a very key, important aspect of adaptation. And finally, what we take away is the awareness that not all sections of communities have access to the same adaptation options. because everyone has access to different kinds of options, they choose differently and prioritize differently. It is really important to start thinking of policies in terms of access to policies rather than just designing policies that seem great, of course, but to ask the question on whether everyone is benefiting from these policies. So I want to end with just this thought in terms of so what, right? So a lot of the global stocktake essentially has been sort of focused, and ever since, the national adaptation planning process has been going on for years, but the Paris really concretized that planning process for all countries, not just developing, not just for the global south, not just for developing countries, but all countries now have to move towards national adaptation planning, has received a lot of focus now in the global stocktake. But if everyone does not adapt in the same way, everyone has access to different bundles of adaptation solutions, therefore decision making becomes really important at micro levels. And there's no engagement. When you look at national adaptation plans that are being developed now are very, very high level, sort of sectorally structured and aligned with national level development policies, etc. And you have consultations, but they're with very high level stakeholder consultations. What you do not have formalized in this entire process of adaptation planning is local adaptation planning. And this research and hoping this data that really pushes for understanding more integrated and understanding of adaptation from the grassroots levels will bring out some importance of why local level adaptation planning is important. So what I've shown on the right here is essentially an example of one of the best and probably one of the very, very few successful experiments with local adaptation planning in terms of how it was designed was in Nepal, where they actually had a formalized local adaptation plan for action framework, which was essentially done through the government, not just something that was donor driven in a few pockets, but was done formally and taken over by the government, which really integrated with the National Adaptation Plan, which means that while the National Adaptation Plan is able to give a bird eye view, give integration with larger development policies, facilitate financial resources, and do a lot of the access national and international policy priorities. What the local adaptation planning process did was increased collective engagement at the grassroots levels from districts, from villages, for people to therefore identify and prioritize what kind of adaptation solutions really work for those particular regions. So because farmers and because households access completely different kinds of adaptation, if you're only doing it at the macro level, you will end up losing out on people not having access to adaptation solutions if you only do it at the macro level. And therefore, a more participatory process from the bottom and integrating it with the national adaptation policies becomes really important, where they can feed into one another, right? Where they can feed into global and international policy priorities, as well as financing and planning that comes from the national level, whereas the local level provides more hands-on in terms of integrating it with understanding what is happening on the ground, what kind of vulnerabilities are being faced in particular districts, particular regions, what kind of solutions are best that best respond to particular districts, and which are the kind of different kinds of population which are there in the district which respond to adaptation differently and climate shocks differently, and therefore to ensure that different kinds of adaptation the adaptation plans actually make space for adaptation priorities of different communities. So thank you very much. I will end with that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shreya. And I didn't get a chance to introduce Shreya. Shreya is a researcher on climate change policy and adaptation at International Water Management Institute, IMI, in New Delhi. I already see a lot of questions in the Q&A box and 3 hands raised for Q&A. But before going to our Q&A discussion slot, I would like to invite our discussant for this webinar, Dr. Darshini Ravindranath, who is a senior researcher and research group lead under the Water, Climate Change and Resilience Program at IMI. Prior to Amy, Dr. Darshini was a principal policy advisor and program lead international climate at the UK government, where she led teams overseeing UK AIDS program in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Over to you, Dr. Ravindranath.
Thank you. Thank you. And looks like there are quite a few questions, so I'll try and be quick. But thanks, Shreya. That was really, very interesting, and I think a very, robust and holistic assessment as well. The first time I started working on, looking at climate risk, vulnerability, adaptation, it was an indicator framework that was just very basic, just looked at just very clearly, just biophysical indicators and a few, I think, indicators of socioeconomic ability to adapt. But it's really nice to see over the years how the assessments have actually improved significantly. And I think a lot of this is down to the fact that we are doing these locally led household level assessments of adaptation and the ability to adapt. So I think that's really nice to see. I think just a couple of very sort of quick comments. I think, you already showed sort of how the full spectrum of indicators, were included. It's nice. You're looking at sort of local level indicators that are derived from the communities themselves. Particularly, I really like the discussion around social dynamics. We particularly when we're talking about South Asia, there's so many things like caste, hierarchy, power dynamics, who actually, and simple things like who lives closer to the center of the village, so they have access to water, for instance. So these are sort of really simple things that when you go on the field and you do the work, you can see, but they're really hard to capture when talking about wider assessments. And I think these are really, really important. And it's nice to see so much focus given to this under this. I think one of the things that I missed a little bit was looking at traditional coping capacities within the wider frame of adaptation. So, people rely on traditional rainwater harvesting systems. They use traditional ways to store grains, for instance. So that significantly improves their capacity to adapt, but it's usually missed when, doing these sort of vulnerability and adaptation assessments, particularly when they're doing it at a national level. It sort of becomes a very tick boxy exercise, but at a household level, these are things that, we can actually look at and understand. So they'll eventually be reflected at a national level. So it'll be good to understand if any sort of assessment was done around those. And some of the other indicators that you spoke of, the middle tier and whole system indicators like crop diversification, looking at land holding size and all of that. I think they're really important, but it's important to incorporate those alongside indicators of social dynamics so that you get the full sort of picture, I think. And one sort of quick thing going back to sort of the politics of access, as we say, we've got we look at access to water, access to electricity often as improving a household's capacity to adapt. But it's also important to look at how reliable this access is. So it's not just that they have a line of electricity going into their households, but how often are they actually getting this electricity and are they actually able to use it? So I think looking at reliability of access is also something that's quite important. And maybe you've already looked at it, but that would be something that would be good to work through. And also government programs, in India, for instance, we have the MGNREGA that, actually, when you speak to households, that has provided a lot of relief during drought seasons and, so on. So how have those been incorporated into the assessment as well is something that we'll look at. And finally, sustainability of some of the adaptation strategies. I think under TAFSSA as well, but I work on a project where we're looking at the impact of groundwater use. And it would, so if one of the ways of adapting is diversifying the, crop diversification through increased sort of irrigation from groundwater sources in an area which is already considered depleted in groundwater? How are we incorporating the sustainability of this? On paper, that's, they've got crop diversification, they're getting increased income, they look good in terms of the capacity to adapt, but how sustainable is this? Because vulnerability is a very dynamic, it's a very dynamic process in itself. So not just looking at it from one point of time, but how can we sort of map it a little bit ahead, thinking about how sustainable are these sources of adaptation that we have. I think that is something that would be quite interesting to understand. And more widely, I think I really liked your last slide on the sort of so what question and how that, how do we relate all of these, really interesting insights that we're getting at a household level, and how do we map that? How do we feed that back into larger processes? You spoke a little bit about national processes, but we've also got global processes, the global goal on adaptation. It looks to sort of address global progress on climate adaptation. And one of the main gripes has been at a global level that adaptation has largely been small scale and it's been slow. So the global goal on adaptation was brought in to the picture to sort of make it a more, get people interested, get people talking about what adaptation is and how we measure it. But there is a lot of space for, I think, locally led adaptation, the assessments to feed into this. There's a lot of processes. I don't want to name them all. There's the Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program on global goal and adaptation. And now there's the UAE Belém. And all of these are they're looking at these locally led studies. They're looking at indicators at a local level and looking at how we can, bring that into the global scale. Countries, in sort of taking stock of existing approaches, countries are highly encouraged to consult and input from practitioners on the ground from work like this. So I think it's important to sort of have discussions like this so that they're brought to the forefront, and indicators that are not traditionally looked at are also been fed into global processes and not just local and national processes. I think most importantly, establishing a common sort of understanding of what we mean by adaptation. This is something that we can only get from these sort of studies that are looking at it after, while working alongside farmers on the ground. So I think it's really important to sort of take into, ensure these local communities and organizations have a say in the, GGA going forward. And I think webinars like this and other ways of dissemination that we can think of to sort of get the message out there so that, people are listening, negotiators who are involved in these discussions on setting these goals are listening and understanding kind of issues that they need to take into consideration. I'll stop now. I don't know if you have anything to come back, but I'll stop since I think there's lots of questions. Thank you again. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Ravindra. Shreya, do you have anything right now, or should we go directly to the Q&A because there are quite a few questions and we only have around 17 minutes left?
Yeah. No, I think Darshini's inputs are well taken, and I think it will also help when we start to think more in terms of formally writing all of the findings up and thinking about implications. I think that would be an interesting place to really discuss these. Darshini, thanks a lot. Yeah, I agree that I think sort of just assessing adaptation is not new, but so much of this conversation on so what is that all of this research that's coming out of the local adaptation solutions and responses of farmers and households has just become research. It doesn't really feed into the global process and national process. I think one of the important parts is how do we make it relevant for that conversation. So I think, Isha, we can go ahead with the questions. I do see some in the chat as well.
Thank you. I would like to hand it over to Avinash Kishore, who's a senior research fellow with IFPRI, to moderate the Q&A session.
Thanks, Shreya. And the last question in the sequence from Dr. Narendra Paul is straight to what you mentioned, that if you can read it and answer, he's basically saying it's all top down. Farmers' voices are not reaching to the top. So any thoughts on that?
Culture, no self-reliance of farmers in inputs, especially seeds, dependency for water. Yeah, right. So, like I said, I think it's not a question. It completely mirrors what I did mention during my presentation, is that I think a lot of adaptation, we've been working on adaptation for decades now, I think. But I think more and more the conversation has become about how do you bring voices to the table. So there are these two major questions. One is how do you assess it, and how do you bring voices to the table? And I think they are completely linked. If you do not bring voices to the table, you will never learn how to assess it, because the biggest challenge with adaptation is that it's so context specific that what is considered adaptation here can be maladaptive somewhere else, and can completely not support adaptation in a third place. So if you do not bring these voices in, we will not know what constitutes adaptation. So I think bringing and I think that's one of the reasons why even this research, which appears, you might find a ton of literature that has done assessments on finding out how people adapt. But unless you identify the inequalities in terms of how people adapt, make those heard, and make different kinds of representation on the tables that are discussing adaptation, we will not get global process of adaptation right. So I think this linking of the household to the global becomes a very important conversation, what we're
Shreya,
having.
there were two questions related to data. One was by Mr. Meher Bhuiya, or Dr. Meher Bhuiya. He asked that, did you consider internal migration as a response to, as an adaptation mechanism? There was another question, I forget who asked it, was that, did we look at off-farm occupations and dependence on them as a livelihood response to this?
Right. Maybe, I mean, I could not spend too much time on every slide that I presented, but if you actually go through, and I'm happy to share the slides if somebody does want it, is that if you actually go through all of the responses that we had, we actually looked at very, very different kinds of questionnaires that have been covered by different research papers, secondary data, etc., to see what kind of solutions do a questionnaires generally offer in terms of solutions. And we did not have the freedom to have 50 options. The idea was not to have like this 2-hour questionnaire on just one module. So we've tried to combine it, but we've given broader options. So you will find that amongst our livelihood options, we do have migration as an option. So one is, of course, moving to off-farm livelihoods within in situ, just outside of agriculture, but also doing either short-term migration for livelihoods or long-term migration for livelihoods were also solutions that we offered in terms of responses. And if you see my more cumulative data is that a lot of households actually do move more strongly towards livelihood solutions to what are agronomic impacts, but they actually solve it more through livelihood solutions and rationing in terms of consumption.
So there's
So,
a question or comment from Mr. Prasant Kumar Mishra, is that in case of poor and marginalized people, households, it's very important in CC adaptation process. Handholding is very important. How do we put it in policy?
yeah. So I just introduced the local adaptation planning process that has been done. So like I said, despite it being a very important process, it really has not been tried out and formalized in most other countries. It's been very, very donor driven, very scattered in some small projects. But like I said, Nepal was a great example of one which had tried to do it right. Of course, financial constraints, because at that time, national adaptation planning didn't exist when Nepal brought out its local adaptation plans, right? So they faced financial constraints with local adaptation planning framework. But the framework is great because it essentially builds local adaptation plans through talking to communities within districts and having much more representation possible. So that's one of the ways to bring people on the table, bring people's voices out, is if you have to go to the micro levels, you have to scale down your policy process. It cannot just be happening in big halls globally. It has to come down to your villages, to the district. So that's one of the ways. Now, the constraint is in terms of how do these smaller governance systems finance themselves? How do these, sort of implement these kind of plans? That's where the integration with the national adaptation planning becomes really important, because national adaptation planning is now being taken since Paris much more importantly, and almost all countries are now in the process of developing this. And at the national level, you have much better capacity to mobilize resources, global resources or GCF and adaptation funds. Now that can be pumped into local levels and, sort of buttress the effort. In Nepal, it was tried out at a time when this process hadn't really strengthened at the national level. So integrating the local and the national. So let the local do the representation, let them do the planning, let them get the solutions, whereas the national level can provide you what essentially is the hand holding in terms of capacity, in terms of policy, in terms of financing, and in terms of government support for, say, social safety net programs, etc., which are more national level programs that can support through, finance and capacities. So I think that would be one way of thinking of it. Avinash.
There's a follow-up question also on Nepal from Dr. Banashri Thapa. I tried answering it, but my answer was quite incomplete. She noticed that there wasn't a lot of heterogeneity in responses or adaptive mechanisms among between small and larger farmers in Nepal. Across the board, they all were responding with the same thing. Any sense why it is happening?
Yeah, so two things. One is, like I said, one of the challenges is that this is currently a cross-sectional data and it's a one-time data. And this was tried out. I think this is because there's an integrated agri-food systems assessment that we're trying out in TAFSSA and developed it for the first time. And the aim is to be able to repeat these so that you're able to have much more coverage. And as everyone knows, that the best solutions or the best responses would come if you go to a place immediately after a climate shock. So there's a lot of pre and post kind of work that is possible. If you go directly after a shock, you would have. But right now we are using more of a recall method. So generally could be a little weaker, but if you repeat this assessment over time and if it allows you for, if we are able to take it up annually or biannually, it allows you a lot more coverage in terms of the kind of shocks that were faced. So Bangladesh and India faced shocks. There was more severity. If you even see the earlier graphs which I had presented, Nepal had slightly lesser severe impacts and severe shocks that was faced within the last 2 years. It was primarily because of that I think that there wasn't a lot of sample that actually responded with having to adapt or cope with a shock. But I think that is something that can be improved as we move ahead with more iterations of this assessment.
So there's another more methods question. This is from Dr. Subhas Nataraja Pillai. He asked if you have provided equal weightage to different indicators. My point is that there's need to give different weightage to different indicators by region, as per the region. Yeah.
So, right now I haven't really given a weightage. Yes, we've used it within our within the model exactly in the same way, but it was mostly used to control for these, and not necessarily. So, if we do end up doing an index, and which we do plan to, is that when you're developing an adaptive capacity index, I completely agree. That has been my idea for a piece of work that I want to do from this data, is that if you look at if you assess with those who are coping, and because we have data in this in terms of people who are actually impacted, you can also get an assessment in terms of which were the indicators of the adaptive capacity which correlated very strongly with coping and those which did not, or correlated very strongly with impact and which did not, right? So it gives you a sense of which kind of indicator of adaptive capacity is most highly correlated. So for instance, in Nepal, having access to a road, where access in general to markets and places is a huge limiting constraint, that would probably have a much higher weightage. Whereas access to a road in Nalanda probably would not be so much because it's very well developed in terms of access in that way. So I completely agree that I think different countries would have different weightages that is required, and that is sort of an intervention that I'm trying for a piece of work that we're trying to do right now. But I think it's a very well taken point that that the way you weight different indices, different variables within that index, it really should be varied by context. And you can only vary it by context if you know which indicator matters. Now, to know which indicator matters, you need data in terms of, okay, then who is actually coping, right? So a lot of this index building work that's generally done in literature does not know who is coping and who is not, because they just collect data in terms of the variables of capitals of households. without asking the question that, okay, you have these resources, but are you actually coping? And if you're coping, then how, right? So that kind of allows us a bit better understanding of which indicator of adaptive capacity correlates with what kind of adaptation. So it's a very well taken point. It's something that we'll try and work on.
There are a couple more questions of the technical nature. Shreya, one is, what's the time frame of or timeline of adaptations that this study looked at?
This essentially took a 2-year recall period because we wanted to look at some of the extremes, and because we were hoping 5 years felt too long for extremes, and 1 year was too short because that only covered one agriculture year. So we tried to keep 2 years because one extreme could affect the next year as well. So we've kept 2 years as a recall period. But if we do go into better iterations or more frequent iterations of this kind of an assessment, then we would get much stronger data in terms of recall.
And I guess the last question, the type question among the type ones, is from our colleague, Dr. Pankaj Koirala. He says that the paper categorizes land size holding by farmers, but I think these categories can be substantially different across surveyed countries. So holdings are bigger on average in Nepal, smaller in Bangladesh, something like that.
Yeah.
So they can be, and the way you classify will have different implications.
Yeah, so I think this is a question which I keep forgetting to put in the answer in the presentation, but it's important that we have not classified all. We haven't classified the different categories of farmers based on the same criteria for the 3 countries. We actually identified for the 3 countries we had done a quartile method separately for Nepal, separately for India, and separate for Bangladesh, so that we do not create a category that somehow all of Bangladesh would fit under. Right. So for each country, we did a quartile, and we made sure that quartile 1 and quartile 4 became. So what we do are able to present is more of the extreme conditions in terms of the very marginal and the large farmers, and looking at the medium farmers separately. So yeah, I think that takes care of that problem, that we are not giving them a homogeneous categorization. It would be impossible. Bangladesh has very, very tiny land sizes. Everything would come under a globally recognized marginal category.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Shreya. I think that covers all the questions. Apart from this, I guess this is for Asia. There are a lot of requests for your slide deck and recordings, maps, and these kinds of things. So just trying to understand what is it that you shared. So over to you, Asia.
So there is one question I think, Shreya, if you want to take, and then I think we will just go to our 2 participants who have their raised hands. Avinash, I can read out the question. This is by Anna Maria, and asking, have you thought about the sustainability of this effort? Are there national or local organizations in these countries that could be able to host this data and update it? And after that, we can go to Mohammed Hussain and Mustafizur Rahman, who have their hands raised for quite a while.
I actually think Avinash would be the best respondent for this question.
Thank you. That's the hope. This is a great question, actually, Anna Maria. This is exactly what we want. And we realized in the first iteration, that's why we did it in only 5 districts, which is sort of because we wanted to pilot it and figure out a leaner way, which would cost less, take less time, and generate satisfactory quality data to answer those questions. So we are trying our very best to form partnerships with national institutions or even sub-national level institutions, and to raise resources to do a second iteration of these in the same or other locations, depending on where people are, which would be even leaner than this, but would get at the core indicator. So this was a trial run for us, a pilot test for us, and we learned a lot from the process, and we are trying to share that with you. So it's a great question. Thank you. Back to you, Isha, for people whose hands.
And also, this data is actually open access. It is already uploaded.
We have shared the data.
Yeah. Isha, maybe you've put it
The
into the
link
chat
is there.
already.
Yeah, it's in the chat box already.
Yeah.
Okay, since we only have 1 minute technically left, so I would now like to ask Mohammed Hussain to please ask the question.
You hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah. Many thanks actually for inviting me to join the workshop. Actually, Dr. Tim Krupnek has also mentioned in this email to join in this TAFSSA work. But during the initial time when I was director wheat research center, that time actually the field work there in Bangladesh, different region actually, or northern region of country. So I mean, I think Shia was there. I think that time, no, Shia
Yeah.
or not
We did this. Yeah, we did this more in the Northwest.
one of the.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, thank you. Actually, I have no more question. Actually, just
Okay.
to don't know what.
Okay, thank you. Any last thoughts, Shreya, Darshini, Tim, Avinash?
Did we
Because we
have
are
one
running
more
out of time.
person with questions?
The hand is not raised anymore, so maybe the question was answered.
Okay. No final comments. Represent
Thank
more,
you
bring
from my side.
voices,
Yeah.
and pretty much
Okay.
all that we take away from our discussion today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And we will have more of these webinars from the TAFSSA data set, and we will share the invites of those upcoming webinars with you. I've put in the chat the link to the blog, which contains the links to all the data notes that have come out, topical data notes from the survey, and also the links to the data set, which is open access. Anybody can use it and collaborate with us as well. So if you are interested, please write to me and we will pass on your request to our researchers, and hope to see you again in our next sessions, which will be on production and markets, the data that has come out from the survey. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Darshini. Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Avinash and Tim. And
Thank
we'll see you
you.
very soon.
Thank
you.
you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
joining.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.